Naming covalent compounds. When you get ready to name compounds, you have to ask yourself the following question. Does the compound we're about to name, does it start with hydrogen? If so, you're about to name an acid. If it doesn't start with hydrogen, the next thing you'd like to ask is, does it have a metal in it? Is it one of the elements you see highlighted in yellow in the periodic table in front of you? If so, you're going to be naming an ionic compound, a compound that is between a cation and an anion. So first of all, ask if it starts with hydrogen. If so, you're going to be naming an acid. If it doesn't start with hydrogen, does it have a metal in it? Does it have a cation? Does it have a positive followed by negative charge? If so, then you're going to be naming an ionic compound. If it doesn't start with hydrogen, doesn't have a metal in it, but it is composed of two nonmetals, the green section of the periodic table, then we're going to be following the rules for naming covalent compounds, for naming molecules. This lesson is about the general rules that you need to follow when you are naming covalent compounds. Covalent compounds are between two nonmetals. When you get ready to name covalent compounds, you need to make sure that you use prefixes in order to determine how many of the nonmetals you see in front of you actually exist within the formula. Now, when we get ready to name these, we're going to exclude the noble gases. As the name implies, they're pretty inert, they're noble, they're not going to react, so we're not going to have them in molecules very often. But as you do so, you'd follow the same rules for the noble gases that we would for any type of covalent compound. So if you take away the noble gases, pretty much the nonmetals you see in front of you, the elements highlighted in green, is what we're going to be using for naming our covalent compounds. You're going to use prefixes: mono, di, tri, tetra, penta, hexa, hepta, octa, nona, and deca. So whenever you get ready to name covalent compounds, you get to put a prefix with each one of the elements. We're only going to use mono if we're talking about oxygen, and only if oxygen is the second element. So the rules for naming covalent compounds are relatively simple. You use prefixes. Now, the second nonmetal in the series not only is going to get a prefix, but it's also going to have an "ide" ending, I-D-E. So let's take a look at some examples and see if we can use these prefixes along with the "ide" ending for the second nonmetal to be able to name covalent compounds. The first compound that you could probably name before ever watching this lesson is the one you see in front of you. This is a pretty common covalent compound, or molecule if you will, and this is carbon dioxide. Notice we use the prefix di for the oxygen because we needed two, and the second nonmetal, oxygen in this case, has an "ide" ending. So use prefixes to tell how many of each atom you have in the compound, and once again the second nonmetal gets an "ide" ending. Our next example is P2O5. Here we have a subscript for both of the nonmetals, so we get to use two prefixes. So we're going to use diphosphorus pentoxide. Now notice whenever you have the A and O coming together for the pentoxide, we're going to drop off the A, so it is just pentoxide. So P2O5 is going to be diphosphorus pentoxide. The next example is going to be where we get to use mono. Mono is used for oxygen when oxygen is the second non-metal. So in this case we would say carbon monoxide. When oxygen is the second non-metal in a series, we will use mono. Another example, PF5, we would use the prefix penta for the fluorine. So you would get to call this phosphorus pentafluoride. PF5, phosphorus pentafluoride. So the rules are actually pretty simple. You get to use prefixes for each of the nonmetals. The second nonmetal gets an "ide" ending. SF6, the prefix for 6 is hexa. So this is going to be sulfur hexafluoride. Sulfur hexafluoride. So use prefixes for each one of the elements, and the second nonmetal does get an "-ide" ending. SO3, prefix for 3 is tri. So this is going to be sulfur trioxide. Sulfur trioxide. N2O3. Here we get to use a prefix for both nonmetals. Prefix for 2 is di. So this is going to be dinitrogen. The prefix for 3 is tri, so trioxide. So we put this all together, it's going to be dinitrogen trioxide. So just to recap, the rules are pretty simple. You get to use prefixes: mono, di, tri, tetra, penta, hexa, hepta, octa, nona, and deca. We're only going to use mono when we're talking about oxygen, when oxygen is the second nonmetal in the series, and the second nonmetal always gets an "-ide" ending. So covalent compounds, you do get to use prefixes.